Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Dickstein, and I'm a professor with Arihanta Institute, and I focus on Jain studies and vegan studies. Today, I will be your podcast host for this episode, and I have the privilege of having as our guest Dr. Laura Wright. Dr. Wright is a professor of English at Western Carolina University and works in the field of vegan studies, actually one of the pioneers in the field of vegan studies. And so as someone who discusses, organizes, and teaches a lot about veganism, animals, and its intersections with other issues, I'm extremely excited to have this conversation, and also excited to have Dr. Wright as a teacher for an upcoming course on gender, animals, and veganism, course number 1021. So let's jump right in. And I'd like to ask you, Laura. Well, first, Laura, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Sure. And I'd like to ask a question that I ask a lot of guests right off the bat, which is, how did you get first radicalized for animals? And like I also say when I ask that question, I know that a lot of people who work in animal studies would say, hey, it's not really radical to care about animals, or it's not radical to think about animals. And while I know that's the case once you're kind of already on the team, as it were, in the mainstream, it's a radical position, or it usually marks a pivot. So how, why, when did you first get radicalized for animals?
So I think I actually was thinking about this initial question before we got online. I kind of think I've always inherently felt something about animals that I felt was not something that other people were feeling. And in some sense, in the Vegan Studies Project, I actually talk about this idea of veganism, and I'm using veganism and not just animal sort of rights, maybe interchangeably, but being sort of an orientation. And I realized that saying that is controversial, there's an orientation toward veganism, but I do think there is an orientation toward a certain kind of empathetic connection with animals that perhaps not everyone feels. And I felt like I kind of had always felt that. The pivotal moment, I guess, if there was one, this is about as good a pivotal moment as any, was that I was in, I want to say maybe the 6th grade, and one of my fellow students' family owned a pretty major sausage company. I can't believe this is such one of those sort of stories I'm going to tell, and it's going to be typical vegan radicalization story. But because her family was sort of well known in the community where I lived, and I was at a school that was very small, they decided it would be great to take us on a field trip to the sausage plant. And I went. I did not actually see animals die or the process of sausage being made, but I did see dead pigs in that facility. And I think for me, I was so horrified by the whole experience. And I remember that being very disconcerting, because I was trying to convey how upsetting I thought that was, and nobody else really seemed to feel that way. Or if they did, I don't remember it. But I do remember that from that moment on, just being all right, that's it. I'm never eating pig again. Anything made out of a pig, I will never eat again. And I didn't. And I think I was in the 6th grade. But I didn't get to make a bunch of other choices about what I got to eat until I left home. But I think that, that experience for me, and I think always being a person who kind of sees animals, I'm not sure how to even explain that, but just okay, I'm going to tell you this story. Because you know this person, so I'm going to tell you the story. Do you know Catherine Marchand? Because she knows who you are. Yeah. She's a friend of mine, and she's I am constantly calling because I'm late to meet her somewhere, go get her, or do something, because I have found an injured animal on the side of the road that I have to save, or that I have to pick a snapping turtle up out of the road, or whatever. And she's like, I don't understand how you see so many animals, because it does feel like I have this like tendency. So that's maybe not an answer about being radicalized, but I think it goes a long way towards explaining what it means to be aware of something, and having always felt aware of animals.
For that, your story reminds me, I mean, you're probably quite familiar with like the famous Simpsons episode, the Lisa the Vegetarian episode.
Oh my God. Yeah, right about it.
Sounds like very similar, right? You said like, but in the film they watched, they all go to like the sausage factory. It's actually like a beef factory, and then at the end, the host looks at the child and is hungry, Jimmy, and the kid like shivering with absolute terror.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? This idea that like nothing makes you less desirous of consuming animals than getting the tour of the sausage factory.
Right, exactly. I mean, it is. And that's what they say, right? Like, that's why they want to make sure that no one can film what happens in there. And yeah, it's horrible. And yeah, and I love Lisa. I have a little section about Lisa Simpson's vegetarian or veganism in the Vegan Studies project.
And then you're also like her because she gives up, right? Like all the pig like products, and there's like that funny part. Well, then with Homer. Anyway, I obviously you recommend that people just watch that episode. I think it is. Yeah. It's a film that even in my own courses we even watch sometimes if we can.
Yeah,
it's just top to bottom, has so many of these touch points. But coming to your point of seeing, I mean, I think that's critical when I think about radicalization, because sometimes if I bring up this issue, there are ways in which people give their kind of like vegan origin story, like when I became vegan, but that could also be a kind of like personal kind of alteration that one makes and doesn't really view it as something that necessarily systemically has to change, but they're just going to opt out of it in this kind of very like personal way, or maybe even it feels moral, spiritual, kind of emotionally necessary.
Yeah.
But I think what you're also referring to with seeing animals, I find that to be quite striking, because not only, you actively assisting other animals, so that actually points to kind of responsibilities to others that we should have, that you're just starting to feel. And, I think I see that most visibly when, we just see animals dead around us in the world, right on the side of the road. And it's actually pretty amazing that it just doesn't register.
Yeah.
At all.
Mm-hmm.
So I really, I appreciate that in the sense of like vision, kind of a certain kind of vision, but it seems like this was something you've had for a long time.
Yeah. And I will say, since not to go into the here's how I became vegan story, but here's how I became vegan. No, I became vegetarian as soon as I could leave my parents' house when I turned 18 and went to college. And I also had, because I think this is an important thing to consider as well, especially with some of the texts that I'm going to be talking about in this class, the perceived connections between, especially for women, being vegetarian or vegan as simply being an eating disorder, or as a means of masking an eating disorder. And I've also written a lot about that as well, that I think vegetarianism and veganism can often maybe be used as an excuse for not eating. But as a person who had an eating disorder, this was always the tricky thing for me, was that when I became vegan, I actually got over the eating disorder. The eating disorder actually ate more once I became vegan. And I had been vegetarian, like I said, since about 1988. And I think I became vegan around 2000 or 2001, and have been ever since. And for me, I just felt like I was trying to be consistent, whatever that meant. Mm-hmm. It felt like I was being more honest if I was being vegan as opposed to being vegetarian and wearing leather. And again, I realized that there's no way to live on the earth and not cause harm. I'm not an idiot. I'm not that naive. But for me, it just felt like this is a choice I can make not to participate in these particular ways.
Interesting. And I definitely will return to this question in the relationship between kind of veganism and the body and eating. And I think it's extremely complicated. Sometimes I kind of like to think about animal studies or vegan studies, which I'm going to ask you about. Like, if we if human beings couldn't consume animals, but kind of everything else existed. So say like our relationship with the exploitation of animals didn't include food, like we somehow just like physically could not process those materials at all, but we still say experimented on animals, had them in circuses, wore their skins. Like, would we understand the terrain better? Because it seems like the food part is just so complex for things like eating disorders and the gendered nature of eating disorders and stereotypical body types and so on. Sadly, I can't imagine that. I don't live in that world where that's not taking place, but I sometimes like to think about that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting idea. And yeah, I think the other thing is, because it is about what you eat, or at least so many people, I think about veganism as being, much broader than just about what one eats, but that you have to eat to survive. So it's not like, giving up something else like smoking or drinking or some other kind of like addiction. I'm not using addiction to talk about food, but I think that when we're talking about eating disorders, an eating disorder is an addiction. And so, food, it's not the same kind of addiction you have to eat. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I also think that in a society that is so centered around meat, around the consumption of animals, like the United States, for example, to not do that is, like you were saying, I mean, it's a radical act. Whether you feel like it's a radical act or not, it's so anti-status quo that it often feels like, I think to people who aren't vegan as well, like you are, it's an act of resistance that they feel is kind of an affront to them for maybe not making the same decisions. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. Maybe we'll come back to it because I talk about it just like a lot of the kind of the pervasiveness and the profundity is impossible to overestimate or overstate or overimagine. I remember a panel in a different context that I was in the audience for, and someone on stage said, usually I just tell my students, like, when in doubt, just say colonialism. Just like whenever you think it's not colonialism, I'm sure we can find a way to be like, actually, we can trace this to colonialism. And I think that's the same with things like white supremacy or anti-Blackness, right? Like, however we think we have a handle on it, it actually goes much darker, much deeper, much wider than that. And I feel, I don't say it in a comparative lens, but just the scale and the kind of ubiquity and in some sense, the universality of our relationships with animals makes it just like so impossible to kind of imagine. And especially because what you say, it's one of the few instances where not only are we using them out of necessity to survive, but actually like consuming them, like making our bodies from their bodies.
Yes, right. It's very postmodern, right?
Yeah. And then, right?
It's human, yeah.
And certain kinds of bodies that then are gendered and racialized and have certain abilities and so on. So that might be a good segue. I think that is a good segue because in 2012, right, you published the Vegan Studies Project, and in many, or 2015, I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
In 2015, and in many ways, you're using this as a lens to look at a lot of different issues. So just for our listeners, can you talk a little bit about that text and say even the project beyond maybe just like that individual text and how you understand the field of vegan studies? Like here at Arihanta, we talk about vegan studies, and I think we use it more in a kind of general, I wouldn't say superficial sense in a negative way, but just covering a lot of the issues that kind of overlap in vegan discourse. And so I guess I'm just curious, how do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I called the book the Vegan Studies Project because I think I'm coined with coming up with that as a term for, this mode of looking at text through the lens of what it means to be vegan. And I know that people have been doing that. I know that, animal studies scholars have done that, but I always felt like veganism was this kind of, like a bridge too far in some ways for a lot of animal studies people. Like I kind of got frustrated at like reading I mean, I'm going to use Derrida. I can't believe I'm going to use Derrida because I'm like one of those people who's like, please don't ever mention Derrida to me again in the context of animal studies. But, to be like he's sort of constantly lauded as this person who, oh, you must quote Derrida, you must cite Derrida if you're ever going to talk about animal studies. You can't ever write anything without putting Derrida in there. And I was like, Derrida wrote some stuff late in his life about animals, and also ate them at the same time. And I kind of feel like there's a lot of that within, and I'm not saying anybody specifically, although I could, but within animal studies, scholars who are writing very much about animals and specifically animals' relation to us, likeness to us, difference from us, whether they are deserving of ethics, whether they are not based on likeness to us and whatnot. And I think for me, I kind of just was like, I want to think about the way the world looks if you have decided that it is entirely wrong and unethical to participate in the consumption of animals. How do you read a text then through that lens? How do you read a text looking for other characters in that text, a la, Lisa Simpson or whatever, who agree with you? And how do we make linkages between narratives that are dealing with veganism specifically in some way, shape, or form? And so that to me was kind of where the idea came from. And I think the specific impetus, and I think I talk about this in the introductory lecture that I'm going to give, is an article that was in the Chronicle of Higher Education by Harold Fromm, who is actually the co-editor of the Eco-Criticism Reader, which came out in 96, I think, with Cheryl Gladfelty. So he's a big eco-critic, pretty environmental literature person, who wrote this like scathing takedown of veganism in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I was just so kind of like, it was in 2010, and I was so taken aback by it that I was like, okay, I have to understand why this very famous eco-critic is writing this like scathing piece about vegans and what that means. And so I kind of went in that direction, just looking at the stereotypes of vegans in the media, the gendering, I think, of veganism as something that's specifically female and white, racializing it as well. And just trying to figure out where in the United States specifically. And this is interesting to me too, because I am not, when you said everything, just say colonialism and we'll find, I'm a post-colonial scholar. So my main areas of focus are like South Africa and India and the Caribbean. So not at all the United States. So I took this very sort of US focus. And then after the book, to kind of talk about it in terms of a larger project, it just kind of got a lot of attention. Like I've written a ton of things before. No one's cared about any of them. This one people seem to kind of care about. And I got a lot of emails. I got a lot of people saying that they really understood and they were really happy to read the book. And then since then, I've actually edited one volume on vegan studies on my own. Then two of them. Another one on the Routledge Handbook of Vegan Vegan Studies, and then the Edinburgh Companion to Vegan Literature, which I co-edited with Amelia Quinn, and I think that came out in 2024. So it's still like this, kind of project that's just generating more and more all the time, which was not really your question, but I guess that's kind of, it feels like it's, it's really shifted from where I started it kind of as a, kind of just for fun to see what would happen. And, then just kind of took it from there and have just used it as a lens through which I read kind of everything.
I think that does help. I think, and the question might not really have an answer because, as an example, so in another course that we've had with, someone, Christopher Sebastian's course on veganism and pop culture, and there's a part in that course, and I've talked to Christopher as well about it, that there's a lot of intrigue into the notion of animals in The Sopranos, right? So he's looking at pop culture using The Sopranos as an example, which is classic. Right. And then I actually recently, because it was part of my childhood, late teens, started watching the show Oz, which is actually the first full-length series on HBO.
Yes.
Actually comes before Sopranos by a little less than a year. And for the first time watching it, which is just like an amazing show about race and ability and gender and queerness and the prison system, of course, but also has animal stuff in it that I wasn't really dialed into. So as someone who works in kind of animal studies, critical animal studies, I'm dialed into that. But I think you're right that sometimes that leaves out what we might call kind of some form of like sibling lenses or adjacent lenses, which is kind of this vegan studies lens that isn't just looking at animals, not because it's not a good lens, but it just adds like another aspect right, to it. So it might be a little bit more comprehensive, one might say, because you're looking at like the myriad forces at play in these media representations.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really interesting. I've never thought about The Sopranos in terms of like a kind of animal studies text, but I mean, it begins with what geese that land in a swimming. Yeah. And that is such an important scene. And when they leave is when he has the panic attack. So gosh, that's I mean,
really there's cool. Also this, not to give a spoiler, right? I think the kind of most emblematic scene, there's a scene in which the horse that he's taken in and kind of pays for is murdered by one of his associates.
Right.
When he's like violently attacking him, the associate says, like, what do you care? You eat sausage, you eat meat, you eat all this all the time. Like, what do you care about one horse? And I think that's like a great example where you're still in animal studies too, but there is something about vegan studies as well, because it's not just what people commonly refer to as this kind of like cognitive dissonance or this speciesism. It's also the fact that eating meat is key for this like mob figure, for his masculinity.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And where I think your work and your emphasis pulls us is then, okay, then we actually have to talk about gender and bodies and class and so on. So when I was looking at just as a way that maybe you could tell us a bit more about that in a description that you have for the Vegan Studies Project, you wrote, or it says about the work, it says her, or that is Wright's specific focus is on the construction and depiction of the vegan body, both male and female, as a contested site manifest in contemporary works of literature, popular cultural representations, advertising, and new media, end quote, as like the focus of that work. So could you talk a little bit about this notion of like the vegan body as contested site? What do you mean by that?
So that's kind of interesting because when I kind of forgot about the description, the book was first originally called the Vegan Body Project. And I was like, the idea was to look at specifically the way vegan bodies were depicted in the media. And at the time I was writing it, I mean, there was kind of a lot of stuff around movie stars who were vegan and health, what it meant to be vegan and to be healthy, how do you get enough protein? So it kind of, interested in the ways that vegan bodies are policed, I think, in ways that are maybe different from non-vegan bodies. And to bring this back to gender again, I will say, I do have a chapter in the book about death by veganism, I think is what it's called, which is sort of examining these cases that were in the media subsequent to the publishing of the book that dealt with child neglect cases where a child would die and the story would be that the child died because the parents were vegan and not feeding the child properly. And I'm like, there's, again, like, saying that people who are vegan have eating disorders is like missing a huge piece. Like saying that the parents of this kid killed the kid because they were vegan doesn't really track. They killed the kid because they didn't feed it. There's a big difference, right? And I mean, it's tragic, but it was just, I was really interested in that kind of the policing of that. And vegan sexual was a term that also had come out sort of around that same time, which was, people saying that they were uninterested in dating or being with anybody who wasn't vegan. There was this huge backlash against that. And that was a very gendered kind of thing too. So it's just sort of, I was looking at the policing of bodies with regard to veganism, specifically women's bodies, in terms of what women are allowed to consume or what is socially acceptable to consume. I do this, and if I'm rambling too long, please stop me, but I do this great thing in my classes. A lot of times we'll talk about like what like if you had to gender food, what foods do you gender male? What foods do you gender female? And then we just look at like a whole bunch of ads for food. And there's this great Tumblr that's called, I think it's Women Laughing While Eating Salad Alone. It's images, like magazine images of women eating salad while looking just so happy about it, you know? And it's just like this very gendered kind of thing. I've rambled all over the place, but yeah, I guess the point is that, like, you know, what the body is allowed to consume, what it is allowed to wear, how much agency one has, especially if one is a young woman and choosing what she eats, and then is potentially, you know, sort of policed about that. Yeah, I guess that was a lot of the work that I was doing, but then ended up looking, okay, wait, let me say one more thing. The other
Say all the things.
Okay. The other thing that I covered in there with regard to gender specifically, one of the things was this concept of veganism, which this reclamation of the word vegan by men who, specifically men like Bill Clinton and Mike Tyson, and I'm trying to think some of these other like the guys who had lived lives where, you know, they had eaten badly, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think maybe too, you know, suffered consequences like heart disease, all these other things, and then had decided to become vegan later in life as a way of, you know, maintaining better health. And this term vegan getting attached to that specific brand of veganism. And then the other thing last thing is, I think the same thing is happening with plant-based as a term, sort of pulling away from like what it means to be vegan. Plant-based feels to me like a very gendered take. Like that veganism is something that requires an ethical imperative. Plant-based means you're just eating more plants for your health, not because of the ethics of eating animals. I've gone all over the place. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I prefer it that way.
Okay.
I think I just had this image when you said Hegan. I had this image of like a He-Man figure from the Guild cartoons that instead of like He-Man says Hegan on it.
Yeah.
And there is something. So I before I kind of lose the track, I could go into a whole other direction, but I am interested specifically, as you mentioned, in the surveillance, say, and the policing of, say, at the time you could say cisgendered female-like bodies, as it were, mostly, and we could get into a kind of racial component of that as well. Whereas there seems to be, on the one hand, this assumption of eating minimally and eating sparsely, eating salads, maybe like fish, light fish, this notion of like, you know, which isn't a fish because it's a fruit of the sea anyway. So it's actually still a vegetable, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
But then there also seems to be this kind of glorification of especially like the normal woman who can like crush a cheeseburger at the barbecue as well, to kind of extend out of that category. But it rarely goes the other way, right? It rarely applies. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what could you say if people were like, hey, I still don't really understand, say, some of these ways in which cis women specifically are psychologized or are pathologized according to their eating practices with respect to vegetarianism? I don't know if there's kind of ways you could kind of like lay that out for someone who's like, oh, yeah, I kind of get that, but I don't really see how it operates.
Well, I think there's just, I mean, with cisgendered white women in particular, I'll go there. And, you know, even like sort of middle class. And I can kind of speak to my own experience as a person from the South who was born in 1970 and raised, you know, with like a lot of sort of, and not all of it is overt. There's just a lot of sort of tacit policing of girls' bodies, just generally. I think once they hit a certain age, there's a lot more attention paid to girls in terms of what they're wearing, in terms of, you know, how much weight they are gaining or losing, or what color their hair is, or, you know, just things that I think perhaps guys are not put upon in the same ways. And so I think that, yeah, anytime I'm just thinking about, like, I've had friends my whole life whose fathers have said things like, you're not going to eat another dessert, are you? Or my dad will just point out anytime there is a woman who he thinks is too heavy, and this kind of thing, you know, like just this sort of attention that's always paid to women. And I think also this very real belief that if you are a woman, you are never just in kind of a state of stasis where you're fine, either too young or too fat or too thin, too smart or too stupid, too angry or too happy. There's just it's hard to find a middle ground. And so I think when women try and make decisions about anything in their lives, there is increasing upon them. And I think, especially to just looking at the overturning of Roe v. Wade and just the extreme police birth control and all these decisions about what they put into their bodies, what they put on them, I think is just always the subject of scrutiny to some extent.
Yeah, that seems quite right. And at least maps on to, even as someone who perhaps even when I was younger as a child participated in, or at least witnessed these things, this constant kind of commentary. One might even say grooming, right? This constant like grooming that is just taking place, micro to macro grooming perhaps to become something. But I think what that also points to, which seems extremely relevant to like a vegan studies lens, is the idea is it's the constant assumption, right, as the non-man as object.
Mm-hmm.
It's a consumption object, and hence it's constantly trying to tweak it to help that, say, woman become the best consumption object, at least.
And the best consumer. Like, I mean, women are, again, the consumers, the driving force. We could go back to colonization again if you want to. The reason for colonization, or at least the excuse for it, women always. So
no, exactly, and I think that's a great example. And to give an example, I mean, is I was recently at a conference down in Long Beach, California, and I was talking specifically in a South Asian context that you need to be careful when there is this feminization or motherization of bovines, because what on the surface seems like some kind of celebration or some uplifting is actually just a further entrenchment in objectification and exploitation. Because if it's as a predication on mothers themselves having not just expectations of them, which they can kind of freely opt out of, but actually coercion and systems in place that kind of force them into these kinds of labor, gestational labor, domestic labor, and whatever else, then be careful, because actually, quote unquote, uplifting bovines to female humans isn't really going to improve their situation much.
No.
And so I think that's the way in which I'm just trying to point to the idea, this kind of tailoring of the habits of women or non-men is really just right in this kind of rhetoric and framework of control of consumption object.
Yeah, totally.
So how would then, to kind of like give this a little bit more content in your course that you're providing for Arihanta Institute, that you're teaching gender, animals, and veganism, you're looking at film, you're looking at text. So I guess the kind of first question I would ask is the more kind of meta question of like, why do you choose this area to look at, right? There's tons of work in philosophy, anthropology, ethnographies. Why are you focusing on this in this course?
Well, because I'm an English professor, I think, more than anything. And my work is always about literature. I think that literature is maybe one of the most important tools that we have for learning empathy with those that are not like us. And I think it's just a means of telling a different kind of truth that is also present in philosophy and ethnography and all of these other things that you're mentioning. But for me, literature is the way that I have connected with the world always, and film too. I kind of, count those the same. But fictional texts that are imagining real things, I think, are really useful in terms of forming some kind of empathetic connection. And again, generally speaking, the texts that I teach are not about people who look like me or you. They're about people from South Africa or West Africa or India or places in the Caribbean, New Zealand. So definitely people with whom most of my students are not going to have much in contact. So to try and, understand the realities of other people and other beings in general, because I do a lot of environmental literature as well. And I think, okay, so I teach a lot of environmental literature, and I teach a lot of apocalyptic literature in that class, because I think apocalypse is a really interesting way of looking at the potential for what could happen if we don't act based on the prediction that the literature provides for us. And I'm constantly using Margaret Atwood because I feel like she's just such a prophet, and, you know, The Handmaid's Tale just keeps coming up over and over again. But yeah, I feel like literature does things that works of nonfiction can't do. So that's my means for doing that. Also, the text that I'm using, I'll kind of talk about those for a little bit. I wrote my dissertation on J.M. Coetzee, who is a South African author, novelist, poet, literary critic, linguist, all kinds of things, who I did a dissertation in 2004. I graduated in 2004. He won the Nobel Prize in 2003, and I got to meet him right after that. He came to Mass where I was teaching. I got to pick him up from the airport. And he was one of the authors that really shaped my thinking about animal studies. And the text that he wrote, or that he presented as his tanner at Princeton in 1997, which were supposed to be, I think, philosophical. They were two works of fiction where he's giving lectures about someone giving lectures at a college, and it's all about animal rights. And so I love that text because it opens up a lot of discussion with students in terms of how do we talk about what's happening to animals, because the trick in that text is that Elizabeth Costello compares what happens in the industrialized West to what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. This really explosive statement, and it causes everyone in the audience where she's speaking to it causes her daughter-in-law to just lose her mind. And then it creates all of this dialogue within the context of the self, which then also creates discussion with the students who have read it. Yeah. Okay. And then what else am I teaching? I am teaching Kang's The Vegetarian, which is a novel that came out in 2015, I believe, was translated in 2015 into English from South Korean novel about a woman who decides that she's going to stop eating meat, and about the ways in which everyone else in her life tries to control that. And specifically her husband, her brother-in-law, and ultimately her father. And then her sister is the one who kind of like maybe comes to a place of understanding about the fact that this is her choice, even though it may be a very detrimental choice, because she's not eating anything by the end of it. And then I think the other two films that I'm doing are Beatriz at Dinner, which was directed by Mike White. And I have an interview with him about that film. He himself is a vegan. He's also the creator of The White Lotus and all of those other great things that are out there. But that film is about immigration, about sexism, about veganism, about capitalism. It's just got everything in there. And then also Julia Ducournau's horror movie Raw, French filmmaker, who the premise of the film starts with a young woman who is vegan, whose family is vegan. And she goes away to veterinary school and eats a piece of a rabbit and basically becomes a cannibal. There's just, I think, so much to unpack in these texts, to look at what they show us about how people grapple with their veganism or their vegetarianism in the face of all these other systems that are in place to control them, and how they negotiate it. And actually, it doesn't really end well for any of the women in these texts. I just realized that as I'm sitting here, that it's kind of a bleak outcome. But I think that has a lot to teach us about why there are so many stories about women in this particular struggle that they are having, and what it says about so much more than just whether or not they eat animals.
It's fascinating. I look forward to a lot of this content as well, because we're having like a recent conversation with some some colleagues about how, sometimes in courses that I've taught, especially for undergrads, we might spend the first class, if it's animal related, listening to David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster together in class. And granted, given like Wallace's kind of reputation in certain spheres of kind of audience is a whole other issue and their identity. But I just like almost, if I'm given the freedom to kind of like isolate one piece. And I kind of mention that because similar to Coetzee's, like, I think you're onto something where it's like, we can have all these kind of fancy terms and rational arguments and go down the line and have all the theoretical jargon. But sometimes there's pieces of fiction or poetry or journalism and just reflection that speak more to the kind of everyday experience of individuals. Whereas in Wallace's piece, it's actually really someone it's kind of balances between being kind of like a bit childish, but also sophisticatedly grappling with the issues. And also in the confines of this massive production of like a lobster festival. So like Americanism and capitalism and mass consumption. And I think people listening walk away, don't feel like they've been proselytized to or shamed in any way. It's just and I think in Coetzee's text, even though it's not like it's not a first person account, but kind of in that realm, you walk away similarly asking those kinds of questions and feeling confused and concerned. Now, I will say, just to wrap up my little anecdote, is that I do wonder the kind of reception that Wallace's piece would have had if it was not written by a cis white man, right? If that piece is written by even a cis white woman, are we still in the kind of the way that Elizabeth Costello is being treated as this text, even though she's a role, right, as a philosopher and as a professor. So but imagine if there was just another piece where just, again, a woman being extremely sentimental about lobsters of all animals.
Well, and that's, of course, the criticism that John and Norma. John is Elizabeth Costello's son, the very aptly named John, and Norma, his wife, who just thinks that Elizabeth Costello is ridiculous. And I think part of maybe casting himself in the role of this character, and I actually refer to what he's doing there as dialogic drag. So I think he's not performing Elizabeth Costello, but he kind of is. And I think, doing it through her voice allows for a discussion of the gendering of the way she's treated. And the text points to that so many times, this elderly, fleshy, gray-haired woman, it's constantly referencing her age, the way she looks, like, why would anyone take her seriously, including her son, who I'm not sure takes her seriously either. So yeah, I think in some sense that's part of why I like to teach it, because it's like you've got a male author, a white male author. Granted, he's South African, which is, I don't know, slightly different, I guess. And he gives all these lectures as Elizabeth Costello. He has a whole series of them. And, so why he's doing that is definitely one of the things that I think is the most interesting question in teaching the lives of animals too.
Okay, so just maybe one final question, and I know we've talked about it, but I like staying within this whatever circle of gender, because it's the focus of the course, and also because of the complexity of the issue, and I have little self-control to go off on tangents and anything that immediately is like, oh yes, that's a really interesting aspect as well. Is what would you say is like in the kind of the films and the literature we're looking at, especially in, I'd say, the latter two, right? You're going to look at The Vegetarian and then Beatriz at Dinner and Raw. What are some of kind of like the main themes that you find that specifically women are being portrayed as, and where the conflict is in these texts? I don't think these are spoilers. I think these are just ways to understand what you think these texts are doing to kind of highlight or push back against, especially say like a cannibal, like a vegan gone cannibal character. For you, what do you think like ultimately these effects are and how they help nuance this discussion?
So I think they are, let me see if I can kind of sum this up with, I think they're all about control. I mean, if I had to say, generally speaking, Selma Hayek's character in Beatriz at Dinner is an immigrant from Mexico. She is a massage therapist. She's like just a total empath. She has baby goats. She's vegan. Her veganism is like highlighted throughout the whole film. She's invited to dinner sort of unwittingly at the home of this person who she's, one of her clients that she massages. And it just turns into like this, the worst possible behavior among the group of people who are at this dinner party. They're just the worst. They're like the worst people that there are. And throughout it all, they're asking Beatriz if she immigrated legally and, just insulting her left and right. And I think one thing that I really love about that movie is that she is so articulate in terms of how compassion is actually harder than destruction. She even says this to the John Lithgow character, who's very much kind of a Trumpian real estate mogul developer, completely awful. But she even says, like, you think destroying something is hard, try rebuilding it or try creating instead. So I've lost my thread a little bit there, but I think for her, it's about this. We get to see the empathy, her empathy, the things she cares about, cast against the ridiculousness of these other people. And I think for me, it's really easy to identify with and empathize with her character. She's kind of new agey, but she's still definitely the focus of the film, and everybody else is kind of tangential to it. The ending, without spoiling it, but the ending does kind of leave us wondering what happened. She, goes off into the sea and goes swimming, and we have no idea if she lives or dies at the end. So it's this very ambiguous kind of ending. I think in The Vegetarian, one thing that I like about that text is that we never actually hear from the protagonist. There's 3 sections of the text. The first one is called The Vegetarian, and it's pretty much narrated entirely by her husband, who is just so disgusted at the fact that he came home one day and she was vegetarian. And then she does other things like stops wearing a bra. She doesn't want to have sex with him. And he becomes abusive to her. And then I think the second section is her brother-in-law, who becomes kind of sexually fixated on her. And is trying to interpret her. And then the third one is her sister at the end coming to visit her in this hospital because she's pretty much stopped eating. But I think one of the things that text really seems to be about to me is the inaccessibility of the narrative of this particular character, Young Hai, who's the vegetarian. She has a narrative, but she's not giving it to anyone. I think there's something really powerful in that, but also, something really problematic in that, again, I think women's narratives often are misinterpreted or reinterpreted or whatever. And I think the novel kind of shows us that happening in real life or in fictional life or whatever. And then in terms of Raw, I'm not entirely sure. I'm about to go. I'm also writing about that film for an article that is due at the end of the month. And I need to go back and watch it again. But I think it's really playing on the idea of veganism as being something that's repressing the appetite of this young woman, because as soon as she eats a bite of a rabbit, she basically becomes just insatiable sexually, in terms of her desires for intaking food of any kind. She even at one point bites into her own arm, like to drink the blood. So I think I'm gonna hold off on saying what I think about that one yet, because it is, of all the things that I'm teaching, the only one that I've never actually taught before. So I always like to have something in a class that I've never done before, so I can explore it as well. Do you do that?
I sometimes do that. I think it's great what you're pointing to. A couple things as we wrap up here, because it really circles back to things that we started with. Like, one, I think that this emphasis on control, but then also on empathy. And we started off kind of just saying how much like this just seemed to come almost instinctually to you. And I think that's actually what seems to be the hardest thing of all, right? Isn't destruction. It's how do you maintain empathy in a world that is telling you that you need to let go of it, that actually this is just some phase or some childish understanding of the world, which is quite terrible. So the real work is how do we actually keep it?
Yeah.
When life is hard, the real world is only made harder the more you empathize.
Right. That's true. It's a very painful position to be in. And I think I'm also really interested in this sort of backlash against empathy. There's a book out right now called Toxic Empathy. I can't remember who the author is, but it's, basically like all of these feelings of care and concern that you are having for anyone who is not just like you is misguided, and it's like this weird Christian argument against empathy, which to me just makes me the world is upside down.
Exactly.
And so have you heard of this book?
No, but when you say it's like the Christian case against empathy just sounds quite.
And it's kind of been a thing there was a piece in the New York Times not too long ago that was about this sort of, it was an opinion piece about the sort of right's attack on empathy and trying to frame empathy as toxic in the way that the left tried to frame masculinity as toxic, which is kind of ridiculous because masculinity in and of itself is not toxic. There are things about masculinity that are, right? So I guess that's trying to turn something around, but they're very good at that. They're good at taking the language of the left and weaponizing it against us.
It's true. And yes, I think that's a good place to pause. I do think it's very also indicative of how much, to repeat something that I emphasized at the beginning, that I emphasize a lot, is that, when we're talking about food and we're talking about animals, we can't just talk about food. We can't just talk about animals because, or at least I like to say sometimes, the last thing food is just food. That's the last thing it is. It's everything else first. So I really think that in this class and kind of the examples you give, students will really understand how charged it is with respect to specifically to gender and beyond. So let's put a pin in that. And Laura, I just want to say thank you so much for joining the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. And I encourage everyone to check out course 1021, Gender, Animals, and Veganism. Thank you so much, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much for helping me clarify a lot of this. It was good.
Wonderful.
Take care.
See y'all soon.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.